Welcome to the Future Generations podcast, providing you with the world-changing content necessary to inspire you, your family, and our planet to a life of optimal health potential. We'll help you make the choices that powerfully influence the lives you bring into this world. It's time to strengthen our resolve to do better now and for our future generations with your host, Dr. Stanton Hom.
Okay, welcome to another episode of the Future Generations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stanton Hom. I have with me an opportune guest. We met by way of almost like just default, just because we've been talking about this regenerative agriculture, this solutions, hopefully industry that is sprouting up. And I have with me Evan Folds, one of the most mind-blowing people that I met on the path of things as we've moved into working with Food Forest Abundance and the Freedom Farm Academy. You are a living soil agronomist. How do you say that? Agronomist, impact entrepreneur, and regenerative business strategist. This is an interesting time. This is in the wake of which nobody's ever heard this because it just happened. But my family is my mom's side of the family is from Taiwan, and in suburbia LA, my grandpa had this little maybe half-acre farm, and all he grew were Taiwanese vegetables and fruits like sugarcane, dragonite, loquats, guava, cherimoya, wax apples, all these things that were just so foreign to America, but what they grew up with. And there's a Taiwanese farmer in North County, San Diego, that my mom somehow got connected with, and we just visited his place, and he's just like, everything's regenerative, everything is like, and it was such a cool experience because I just went through my design consult, or not consult, but just review with Chelsea out here. And it's just a mind-blowing experience, man. Like your guys' framework for life and abundance and what the earth offers is so much more than whatever you want to call a climate thing or environmentalists. Like you guys, when you're in the actual, like in the actual trench, in the actual dirt, in the actual soil, and you bear witness to what nature can provide. I don't think we have a framework for that in modern America, especially here in Southern Cal. But Evan, I would love you to introduce yourself so our audience gets to know you both personally and professionally, man.
Amazing, truly, especially the synergy of how you're being inspired by, the type of farming that you're connecting with, and it's not surprising that you put yourself out there to develop that at your own home, right? Like there's magic in there that is part of what we lost the thread for in the United States. I mean, you just named a whole lot in that space that's entirely relevant to a lot of the things that are alive with me. It's fantastic. I mean, there is an abundance available to us, and we're remembering, right? Like there's these concepts that can really help you understand that where we've come from, we had abundance, and we have been put in a box, to use the cliche, right? And you also named climate and environmentalism, and we've reached a point where those sort of monikers are sort of scoffed at by half of the people, right? And the problem is that a lot of that is politics, but a lot of it is true, and where you end up is very confusing because there's a level of certainty on either side, and then there's also a depth of wisdom on either side that can't speak to one another, and it becomes this subterfuge of really confusion. And so it's been a real challenge in some ways. I mean, as far as an introduction, I woke up to this reality maybe almost 25 years ago now. And after an experience of really, I would say it was more unconscious at the time, but to give you a window, I went to a major university, got a degree in biology and religion. I was always trying to tie it all together, right? That was like what my impulse was. But then I went to be educated, and I was completely uninspired and disappointed, right? Because school puts you in a box and sends you in the other direction, right? So doesn't see the forest for the trees. And so I came out of university and was really uninspired. And I actually moved to the Virgin Islands. I had an opportunity to start paying rent on my cousin's place that he was moving out of. And long story short, this book found me called Secrets of the Soil that just totally inspired me and blew my mind. And I couldn't believe half of what this book was telling me. And the roommate that I developed was a landscaper and introduced me to a biodynamic farmer. Biodynamic agriculture is developed by Dr. Rudolf Steiner, who's been a real guiding light for me in my professional life and personal life. And so from there, started a garden center, ended up with 5 businesses at one time. It was a real boot camp. I, came through there maybe 4 or 5 years ago, stepped back from a lot of that and explored what I really wanted to do, which was, to teach and learn, right? That moment of like where someone's leaning in, interested with what I've been able to collect and been blessed to have been taught, and I can pay that forward and I can learn from them. That's really the sweet spot for me. So you'd say I'm a consultant, and the lens that I use, my consulting platform is called Be Agriculture. The premise is that we're a part of agriculture, whether we like it or not. We're agricultural beings, if you really boil it all the way down, and we've lost that thread. And the premise is that the further we get away from agriculture, the more dysfunctional and sick society gets. And one of the insights that I picked up along the way is I think the reality that agriculture is more than farming. Eating is an agricultural act. Probably my favorite quote, Wendell Berry. So the lens is really food, farming, and health. And if we understand that the way we eat and the way that we farm has an impact on the human environmental health, that threefolding is really the sweet spot. And all of a sudden, agriculture deserves a seat at every table of decision. And that's sort of the lens that I use to say yes to projects. And it's taken me some really amazing places they're continuing to develop. So it's kind of a once around the track of where I'm coming from.
It's pretty amazing, man. Because I would say it's one thing to learn about regenerative agriculture. It's one thing to know that it's a solution. It's one thing to it's a whole other thing to like be it, right? It's a whole other thing. Like you're just coming back from South Africa. You're also just, in the short time that we've known each other, and the documents I get to read and how you're educating me and like the not just the biodiversity of what soil is, but just the fact that I think the best way that I can say it is the proponents for whole food nutrition that I have learned from Francis Pottinger, Weston A. Price, Royal Lee, like these guys would say like, sure, take vitamin C, right? Like ascorbic acid, it will do something in the body, but it has nothing when compared to like the whole complex of vitamin C, which is like 9 known components that synergistically work together that you might find in a citrus fruit or something like that. But then they would step back they would take another viewpoint back and say, but it's also the unknown things that we've never actually discovered, that we're humble to, that's so radically more important, because there's an infinity of unknown that is, our seeking and search as humans, because essentially maybe that's a gift and a curse to be on the search, right? Whereas most animals just innately know these things, hopefully. But I think it's a beautiful thing, because I feel like that's something that I've learned so far from you. Is a humbleness to this nature that most of us could never really fully encapsulate,
Beautiful, man. Yes, it's this concept of how things work together is layered. One of the experiences that I had in that book, Finding Me, is what it gave me is that there's more to life than what's physically here.
Yeah.
Right? Like that was the nutshell. And that can sound simple to a lot of people, but it's really profound. And one of the reasons it is that it doesn't go all the way to, well, this is what it is, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of where religion goes, right? And then you've divided yourself, right? Like all we need to do is just stop and have reverence for life, right? Like, and we don't do that enough. And I like to ask the question, why does a plant grow up against gravity? And it's somewhat of a riddle, because if you really follow the thread, Victor Schauberger, he was one of the early inspiration for me. He was known as the water wizard, and he lived in the Austrian outback, essentially in the woods as a forester, and he made a relationship with water, and he intuited the regenerative capacity of implosive energies as opposed to explosive energies. Nature doesn't waste energy. Like when we use internal combustion engine, nuclear energy, I think nuclear is probably the most efficient, but there's only like a 16% energy transfer. The rest is heat and pollution, et cetera, right? In order to use energy, nature doesn't work that way. Nature is completely efficient. There is no waste. So this implosive moment was really part of it. And Schauberger intuited, comprehend and copy nature was really kind of what he was looking at. And so this idea of coming into life force and reverence for life force. Schauberger would say, we're taught in school, Newton got hit in the head by the apple. Everybody's heard the story, posits gravity. But how much time do we spend actually considering how the apple got up there to begin with, right? So it's sort of a thought form into this concept that we're really telling ourselves half the story. And it's really built on this premise of measurability, right? And that we're coming out of this materialist age. And it's another thing that Steiner gave me is, we've kind of come from spirit, moved through a materialistic moment that in Steiner's viewpoint was, I'll say by design. I'm not trying to be there's no religion in that, but in a sense, the human development over time couched in principles like reincarnation and karma, which is really what Steiner was bringing forward. When you look at the whole entirety of the human development, the Sumerians, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians and Chaldeans, the Greeks, and then us, right? We come from spirit, we come down through the Grecian period, and this calls it the fifth post-Atlantean epoch. It's sort of strange language, but it's 1924, 1925 when he passed. But his karma lectures describe this development of the human, and it really gave me a lot of peace when I studied it, because you can look around the world and say that it's on fire, rightfully so, right? But what if it's there to engineer our awareness of ourselves, right? And there's this way of looking at the things that are happening rather than the sky is falling. We're right where we're supposed to be. And I resonate with that highly. There's no pure good and pure evil. There's a balance, right? And it's how we navigate it as conscious beings. And you made a statement a minute ago that kind of triggered a thought. I've held this concept of I call it egolution. That the idea that humans don't evolve in the Darwinian sense, let's say. There's no natural selection or survival of the fittest. If an eagle had 20/40 vision, it wouldn't find any food, right? We put contacts on, right? We manipulate our environment, rather than the other way around. So there's actually not a word in our language that identifies human development. And what happens is, and it's subtle, but when we say humans evolve, what we're really saying is that we're just going through our motions, right? And in the spirit of that, we're not taking responsibility for the uniqueness of our consciousness. The idea that we can say I, that animals cannot do that. They operate through a group soul, right? They're in balance and in rhythm with nature. So we come from nature, clearly, but I don't know that we've fully seen ourselves for what we actually are. And that's this next stage that we're in, is really this awareness and this ownership of the fact that we're the only species that can screw it all up. And we're also the only species that can fix it. Right?
That's crazy, man.
We got to take responsibility for that, or we'll annihilate ourselves.
So I think you're speaking around it, and maybe it's too much to ask you to refine it, but what would you posit as one of the biggest challenges we face today?
Well, wow. I think what it is facing ourselves. I don't want to be too vague with that either. You could let's just talk about, the moment, the last 3 years we just lived through, right? Like what that was is an exercise of the outsourcing of our agency, our ability to make up our own minds and stand in it with any sort of intention or backbone. And, I don't want to posit that as necessarily a criticism of people. I think it's a natural, phenomenon of where we've arrived at this moment. It's sort of like Donald Trump getting elected. I'm not a Trump fan, but I can look at the other side and not be binary and say, well, what's better, best, worse or worser. I don't know which way you want to look at it, but I think it's all a reflection of where we're at. So we can get really caught up in issues, and I'm a Bucky Fuller fan. You don't win by fighting the system. You build a new one that makes the existing one obsolete. So I try to put as much energy as I can into projects that I believe are not trying to fight the man necessarily. I mean, there's a little bit of that in all of it because it's all connected. But to really focus on systems that can reinforce what we would all want if we were asked. And I think that's the moment we're missing, is asking ourselves what we want and then putting true intention into trying to build that with other people. That's really the solution.
It's hard to do today, right? Because I think that speaks to so many layers, right? If you want to talk about the last 3 years, like to find the truth in a world where censorship is normalized, and then, but even before that is this industry of media and marketing and all these things that you're asking, like what we want, but what we want is through the lens of what media we're exposed to, that they are, in a lot of respects, television programming us for that. And I think that's an important factor that I think what you do affords, and what this whole industry affords, like you were just sharing beforehand, if you can share about that, you don't have to if it's private, but being in South Africa and having a humbleness, right, to systems that already are there versus coming from the outside and saying, hey, we know how to do this. We know more than you do. And, actually it's more synergistic. Actually, it's recognizing that there's probably a heck of a lot more that we've forgotten that these people are probably going to help us remember. And it's through that remembering that potentially that solution resides. Otherwise you don't, right?
Yeah.
Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's very much it. And, I mean, so I'm blessed to work with a group called Project Biome. It's founded by Dr. Zach Bush, and I'm one of the project managers activating a project in South Africa that has maybe the biggest vision you could ever cultivate of rewilding the river systems, regenerative agriculture, green technology up the prime meridian, first time meridian from Timbavati in South Africa up to Giza, in the effort of rewilding the Sahara Desert to a savanna again. And that's a big vision, and you got to start somewhere. And we're underway, and we're a couple of trips deep over there. And what you're referencing is just a short conversation we had before we were on here. And it's I think at this point, the traditional model of, hey, we've got a lot of money, here it is, we're going to start programs, without really investing in the people that are there, but more trying to solve all the problems as if we've got it figured out coming from the outside in, is an old model. And even the people that live there understand this now. So what we're trying to do, kind of fumbling through, is figure out a way that we can, sort of fill the gaps and bring the spirit, if you will. And even more directly, the irony being that we're really there to save ourselves.
Wow.
I mean, in all reality, it's sort of a terrifying thought, but the United States has lost the thread. When you're in South Africa and you're in some of the poorest places that you can imagine, after you eat, you get up and you sing and you dance. Right?
Wow.
Like that would never. You just have these experiences where, like, well, people. It's not that we're not happy in that way, but there's a spark of magic, or of really what we are, that's still alive there, because we haven't beaten it out of ourselves, for lots of different reasons. But it's a tremendous opportunity to reinvent ourselves. Similar parallel example, it's like I heard a stat, like, the country of China has more solar panels per capita than anyone else, because they hadn't built an electric grid to everyone yet, right? Before they started to industrialize. And it's sort of that way on an infrastructure level in Africa, where you don't have everything figured out, and the billion-dollar infrastructure projects that you can't just turn off, right? Seemingly, because you've made the investment.
Interesting.
And then we double down, right? It's different there. So there's really a moment where you realize in South Africa, 500-700 years ago, the white man had not reached South Africa yet, and before that, it was oral tradition. The wisdom was still intact in a sense, and you hear the prophecies from the average person there. We've lost those prophecies here, right? And it really makes me think about, you asked me earlier on a couple questions, and I think one thing to bring up in terms of original impulse, and at the same time, I think a potential solution is nourishment, really. And I'll bring back Steiner for a sec. The book I read after Secrets of the Soil was a book called was the accumulation of his lectures on agriculture, called the Agriculture Course in 1924. And he was asked, how do we regenerate the life force of a farm?
Wow.
And what the preface of this book, he was in a conversation with one of his disciples, his students, Dr. Earnhardt Pfeiffer, who actually started the first municipal composting operation in the United States in San Francisco in the 1960s. So Pfeiffer was asking him, why do people not show up for themselves? Why do they not carry out their spiritual intentions for themselves, paraphrased? And Steiner's answer was a matter of nutrition. And he said that food plants no longer contain the forces people need to build a bridge from thinking to will and action. And when I read that passage, and that was in 1924 when he said this, and when I read that, the world made sense. I don't know how to describe it. It was just like, oh, we're all malnourished without a high level of intention. And, I proceeded to start a wheatgrass business and watched this life force of this, the life force from wheatgrass is really the magic. Name something in your diet consistently of any potency that was harvested within 15 minutes.
Wow.
Right. And so at that point, 15 minutes and later, the enzyme content begins to break down. The life force is not as strong. It's not as therapeutic. Now, can we measure that? Maybe not. Right. And my kids are going to get home, so we can just.
It's all good.
Wait. Hey guys, I'm on a podcast. But what I realized in doing this wheatgrass is that the life force of the material is really what the magic was. There is no consistency in our diet in this way. And I watch people, cure fibromyalgia, cancers, even. I mean, all sorts of unbelievable impacts that could never be measured or replicated in a way that could be made scientific, right? So I've had these experiences where, combined with this wisdom that reached me at the timing points of my life that really blasted me into a place that brings me to here, right? So it's just always a pleasure to be able to share this kind of thing, because initially my thought was I was inspired in this way. All I need to do is just tell other people about it, right? And what I learned very quickly is it's not that direct. It wasn't about converting people. It was about holding space. And as I've done that through the years, ironically, what I've been able to collect and what I'm doing has become more valuable. And I'm just very excited at the type of people with the energy, that I'm able to connect with. I include you as one of them. That's just a true inspiration.
I wish it were that easy, right? But maybe it's our humanity that prevents it, right? Because there's this whole communication, mentorship, leadership, teaching that essentially, like you're saying, has to start with holding space, which in many respects, many listeners may not even know what holding space actually means, right? And so, but nature does that, right? Nature essentially is the fabric of that life force in so many ways, and it's our disconnection from nature that has prevented us from recognizing that we are an intimate part of that. One of my teachers would always say, he was like this chiropractor, master's of science dude, super genius guy, but his dad was a PhD biologist, and they would just go into the backcountry. And he said, like, I used to get my food when my dad would drag me by my feet and my teeth would be raking up the soil. And it was like, that's how he was brought into the world, recognizing that he was a human animal, that we are now in this time, 100 years into this time of a medical model, but also a chemical model and an agricultural model that essentially has been so ransacked by this chemical industry, this hyper mechanistic, hyper objective, system, that we don't even see that human physiology and biology is learned in a completely different building than biology. Like, we don't even see that's a discrepancy. Health sciences and medical schools versus like zoologists and actually understanding the way that the fabric of nature actually works is a foreign concept. We don't even see that contradiction. And I kind of want to ask you maybe more further, when you say like brings you to here and now, where is here and now for you, for someone like you that has such a diverse um like essential toolkit now and what you're actually about and what businesses that you run and what projects that you're a part of. If you could verbalize maybe what that bigger mission for you individually is, I'd love to see how that could potentially shift and change maybe even our individual listeners to some degree.
Wow. Well, I appreciate the question. I think the way I would answer it is diverse. I don't hold a singular way forward, and it's not totally conscious either. I'm more just kind of coming to this in response to your question, but there's strength in diversity. You could start there, right? And that's a real thing that is really universal. It's a basis of proper agronomy, all aspects of society, et cetera. So I think where I'm at is that I feel like in some ways, the last 20 years has been a boot camp, school, and in this way that I can't describe. I didn't go looking for it, and I feel like it was looking for me, and I feel very blessed by that. And I'd say, the first good portion, maybe the first half of the last 20 years, I was sort of blind, and I was in the right ballpark planting seeds, right? But I didn't quite see the big picture in the way that I think I'm holding more so now. And by no means do I have it all figured out, but I think in response to your question, where I'm at is really applying these things. I mean, one of the things that I've found I'm able to do over time is take ideas which are uniquely human, right? And in one way of holding the concept of an idea is it is the spirit, right? And this idea of being able to bring that into the physical world is just really fascinating to me. And so that for me, that looks like, I'm an elected official where I live. It's called a soil and water conservation district. And the charter of this position, which if there's anybody out there that's heard of them, most people have not, is to protect and enhance the quality of soil and water, which if you follow that thread is just about everything, right? And it happens to be in the government, and it's a state level position with local contracts. So I like to say I found a way in because, I'm not paid. It's not a paid position, but it's a state level designation. I have a title, it allows me to navigate the system. I'm also not in the local city or county hierarchy, which sort of allows the freedom to bring new ideas, right? So I sort of like to stir the pot and, in the good ways, it'd be a little different if I was trying to cause trouble, but all I'm really trying to do is bring in the concept of systems thinking, concepts of rights of nature, the idea that we can't just pollute rivers and expect it not to impact public health, right? And we don't, that doesn't reach a balance sheet. So, how do we create accountability within these realms? There are very real legal paradigms like rights of nature that people are not aware of, and the result of not being aware of these things is that we give up, right? And what that looks like is that we're not thinking for ourselves. And that equation is just abundantly clear to me. And so my work is really around the prism of, the world being written by narrative and incentive, right? If you have the story right, which we happen to have it wrong, to your comment about TV, turn it on and try to withstand that. If you're awakened on any level to these things, and it's difficult to stomach how bad it is. And so, that narrative has been flipped around, but man, we've got the best story you could ever tell. And marrying that with incentive, this idea of, how do we go out and operate unconsciously? We're undermining what we would want if we were asked, and that you could look at that in a lot of different ways. So, how to toggle those things in ways with intent to move them in healthier directions is really the work, and that creates a level. It really, it's strange because we're coming from this place where it's difficult, to your comment earlier, to have the right kind of intent because you got to pay your bills or you got to do X, Y, or Z. So it's a constant balancing act of faith and putting myself and taking risks within the world because this is all against the grain, and trying to find a way to bring the level of financial reality that will allow this work to move forward. And I don't want to say it's easy by any means, but it's getting easier.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
a good sign, right?
Yeah. I think it's remarkable, man, because when you have I love when I get to be around almost like Renaissance men, right? Renaissance men and women that have such a diverse way to express their inborn, like God-given purpose in life, and at the same time, when you start to weave through the congruency of how those things work together, it's pretty fascinating, because you could essentially wear all these different hats but do very similar synergistic things that all, like you say, I mean, that's the thing about nature, right? You're almost living
Yeah.
out like the multi-purpose way that, whether it's one factor in soil, another factor in soil, or another factor in soil, you are teaching me, whether it's through the minerals or through the exchange capacity
Look at you. Yeah.
capacity to pH, to what the history of the soil was, like from an essential component, beneficial factor of soil. It's not single focused, right? It's not one thing. It's this holistic way that
Mm.
it impacts the whole. And if you look at it from a toxicity perspective, where you're just like, hey, look at the history of your soil, and what were all the products that you sent me all the half-lives, you sent me all these to understand that it's not just now, right? It's not just an immediate, although it is, impact. It's an impact that will reverberate throughout the future, until that chemical toxicity, which is also holistic in the way that it impacts your soil and living beings. It's remarkable. It's such a cool way to essentially live out, maybe more congruently, like what you believe in, and what your purpose in life actually is. It's kind of neat.
Oh, that's so cool, man. Well, thanks for seeing me, like, for real. I'm not joking at all. That's it. And you're reflecting in a way that is really meaningful, because yes, I think that is absolutely true. And this idea of you were touching on, that there is no single component, right? It's sort of like, one of the themes that we talked about in our engagement was the pH is a very poor way of evaluating soil health. That's
Mm-hmm.
become the way in which the extension service, who is sort of the expert, they're the MD doctor that never went to nutrition school, right? And they mean well, don't get me wrong, but they're very limited in their scope. And so that concept, anytime you become homogenized or singular, monocrop, whatever it is, right? You're creating dysfunction as much as you are a benefit, and you're mining an application that's taking advantage of a natural system for human benefit. So how we do that is very critical. And one of the things that comes when what you were sharing is, you know, I'll reference Steiner again because it's so easy to use him as an overlay, but he came up with this concept that was called the threefold social organism.
Mm.
And the idea of uh, the the farm or the city or the earth as an organism, right, is very powerful. It's a lot of it's the motif that we're using in our work in Africa. And that's essentially what the basis of biodynamic agriculture is. He was creating the preparations, potentizing them with very specific plants and animal materials, almost witchcraft kind of stuff, but he was increasing the vibration and harnessing the vibration of these natural materials that, when applied to water and sprayed to the fields, or when applied to compost, basically brought the vibrations of the different organs of an
Wow.
organism into play. And it took me a long time to really put all this together. And then what he was doing is those organs and those preps were in alignment with the vibrational realities of the celestial cycle.
Wow.
And when you align the cosmos with the vibrational life force reality through the farm, that's where the power of growth comes from. And it's just right. And so it's life force. It's not the physicality. It's what holds everything together. Again, why does that plant grow up against the force of gravity? Life force. It's alive, right? We don't reference that even in organic agriculture, right? And that's really one of the things I came up with in the past as a consulting platform, was what I call bioenergetic agriculture. The idea that a living system has a physical, mineral, biological, and energetic capacity. And if you think about conventional agriculture, it's physical and mineral. You plow and you fertilize and you create all the problems.
Mm.
Organic sort of backs into the biological, but both discount life force.
Wow.
even scoffed at it, right? So here comes biodynamics blooming to champion life force, but they weren't talking about cover crops and mineral, balance and microbial diversity, et cetera, which are entirely relevant to farming. So my insight was to try to mash all of that together to meet people where they were. And so, that's an example of there not being a center to the
Right.
to the discussion. It's the same way with the human organism. We have a circulatory system, a rhythmic system, a metabolic system. They all work in resonance and harmony, but not from a central standpoint. And that was really his insight into the threefold social order. He was asked after the First World War, everybody thought the world was going to end, and they said, Dr. Steiner, what can we do to save ourselves? And what he came up with was, he essentially intuited what our humanity is from a societal posture. And he said that, humans organize through rights, culture, and economy. The rights being a governmental entity that's supposed to protect our individual rights. Of course, we all know now it's become much more than that. Economy is an exchange of value in some way. And then, our culture, our humanity, we express our creativity. And what's fascinating and what he intuited was if each of those spheres didn't have its own authority and autonomy, that when there was collusion between two of the spheres, that society gets sick. Think about separation of church and state, rights and culture, corporatism, economy and rights, right? So this idea of actually, proactively setting up a socioeconomic and structure that reinforced what our humanity is. And if you take a step all the way back to the founding of the United States, which in some ways, I think even from most people that I meet around the world that have a way of looking at the United States positively for what we are. We create so much destruction in the world, but we really are, the American dream is a real thing. And if you do the history and you look at, what the founders came up with, their original impulse was the Articles of Confederation.
Right.
And it was before the Constitution, 8 years before, I think, something like that. And it had a Congress as the will of the people. They were coming out of monarchy, right? They saw that if we anointed a president with executive privileges or a court that was supreme, that could never be removed, for example, it would undermine our humanity at some point. And that's exactly the world that we're living in. So there was a president, but there was no veto power. There was a court, but there was no Supreme Court, right? And then there was the critical period where the centralization, back to the theme of what we're talking about, occurred. And the Federalist Papers, basically one of the initial propaganda exercises in the United States, and people can argue for better or worse, but that's what it was, brought it into the Constitution and centralized the powers in the federal government. And essentially what happened through the lens of the threefold social organism is the right sphere consumed the economic and the cultural sphere. And what happens is we, as involved in that cauldron, look back at the government as if it can help us or supposed to help us. It's sort of like going to the DMV to be inspired, right? Like it's never going to happen, right? It's not their role. It's not the function of the right sphere in that respect, right? So once you can see the landscape in that way, you can navigate. You can set things up intentionally, right? You can provide authority where it doesn't exist. Because the problem that we're living in is that when we give up our authority, it's very difficult to get it back, unless it burns to the ground and the phoenix rises, right? And that may be what we're involved in here. I don't have that kind of purview.
What would you say? Can you say those three spheres again?
Yeah, rights, culture, and economy.
Rights, culture, and economy. That's really interesting. It's really interesting that we become so hyper focused on that one particular sphere, right? Because I would say that if I went back 150 episodes, that we've just been. I mean, we're demanding rights not because they're not important, right? Not because, but because we've created a hierarchy in something that was supposed to be a level playing field, right? It was supposed to be three equal value spheres that if we focus on, we would never actually have been in this place to focus on our rights anyways.
That's true. And, you could say that, in a lot of ways, we've come out of the default of where we were, and we weren't conscious of it.
Right.
We didn't know any better, right? And I think one way to simplify, the mechanics of how did it happen, really it gets back to us. We walked away from ourselves, right? And we were also, I mean, there's a lot to that. It's not just, we retreated, but we did, right? And did we know any better? Okay, maybe not. but now what do we know? And are we willing to stand in that? And the problem is when the world is challenged on that level, just take the last 3 years, wasn't pretty. But
Right.
the irony to that is it taught us a lot, right? Hopefully,
Yeah.
at least.
So tell me, future pace this for me then, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's something as simple as, taking that myopic focus on rights and spreading it into this, culture and economy worldview, or if it's like you're saying, maybe these particular projects, like what you have going in South Africa with Dr. Zach Bush, and or just being the elected public official where you are, like, can you future pace the world for me? Should we open our worldview into, a more holistic and more broad and more regenerative focus? What happens for us?
Well, that's an important question. It's $1 million question in some ways. I I think what I see, I'm gonna what comes as a Steiner theme again. He looks
Yeah.
forward to, I mentioned we're in the fifth post-Atlantean epoch. So what he sees playing out is what he calls the culmination of the seventh epoch is what's called the war of all against all. And he doesn't describe it as a traditional war, fighting in that regard, like in battle. It's more of a description of groups of social beings that have taken different trajectories, right? Some that, get in the vehicle of, will give you everything you need to be comfortable and, materialism and the like, right? And sort of the way the world's showing up in its phoniness in a sense. And others that are going to build a new way to be in the world. And I resonate very highly with the concept of spiritual science. This idea that that there's half of the story has been hidden from us, and we're in one of the themes I think that is helps me sense make is that the way we can be now is different from the way we could be 1,000 years ago, like
Right.
fundamentally different. Like
Right.
our access to the spiritual world, there's a book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess by Leonard Shlain, and it changed me because his premise was that every time the written word was introduced into a society, it fundamentally changed the fabric of the people from a matriarchal posture to a patriarchy.
Wow.
Unbelievable, and it's without fail. So these ways that we are being influenced and impacted on a meta level that we can't see because we're in the weeds. We're in those moments right now, right? I mean, you could look back at agriculture. I say we're agricultural beings, and there is the history behind that is maybe another podcast. It's really, really interesting. But the bottom line is it wasn't, Tom calling Jerry saying, hey, I invented farming. You should do it this way, right? That happened in 13 or so different places on Earth in relatively the same moment
Wow.
because it was an impulse, right?
Mhm.
Like we were responding in our consciousness as unique individual beings, in a way that you can't really measure or describe, but that happened in history. And I believe firmly that we're in one of those moments. And I believe that there's a percentage of the population that is responding to that at a base level. And there's a percentage of people that are not. And I think you can see it in plain sight. It's just, one person being myself's ability to translate that and its significance is, what does that mean? But I think we're headed for, a lot of people look out and say, well, there's going to be some event. I think it's already happened. You know, I think we're living in it.
Right.
And, I identify with the fact that we are not our physical bodies, right? We are spiritual beings, and that the physical reality that we have entered into is a precipitation of that spiritual reality. So
Wow.
that for me lightens the load a bit, and it also helps me explain, especially in the generations that were before us, which is very dense, um, why the desperation that you see in the world is at hand. Because
Right.
if you believe that, look, we've got one shot and we go to dust and that was all there was to us, you show up in a different way in the world. I'm not here to judge one or the other, but I can tell you that I've been in both places in my lifetime, right? So for me, it's not so much, where do we all go? Unfortunately, I don't believe that we're all going in the same direction, and I really don't see that changing. Now, what does that mean, and what does it look like? I've had glimpses into it, and on one hand, it's terrifying. Um, on the other, it's the most beautiful thing you could imagine, right? And I think that's the world that we live in. People want to say heaven, hell, these sorts of things. I think hell's on earth. You
Mm-hmm.
know, already you go into some of these places where under the bridge, and you see where people have arrived in this life. Yeah, it's hard for me to see that in any other way.
What would you say? I mean, because would you then also argue that, or take the position that, say you are 10, 50, several centuries into the future in South Africa, where you're rewilding the rivers and you have had your hand in this project, and it manifests in its success of essentially a return, right? A return to what this, like, would you consider that like a heaven on earth situation?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think so. I think so. I mean, yeah, it really is, and I appreciate the thought form, and I think maybe what I'd be comfortable describing that as is someone standing in their own agency.
Hmm.
Honestly, that feeling of being able to write a script that you're following because it's how you're showing up in the world. Again, that's something that sounds, I mean, I've been in places in my life where I thought I was there,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I
Mm-hmm.
realized, ooh, I had no clue. And where I've arrived to is sort of where we started in this convo. Is like, the first thing that we know is that we don't. That should be it. And the rest is gravy. But yeah, I appreciate that, man. I think it's all here. I think it's all, we are all one is such a cliche.
Yeah.
It's maybe the only absolute truth in my view.
What would you say? We're a community of action takers, and I love to move people with action.
Mm.
What's one thing you would say that people could do to, whether it's establishing their own agency, whether it's moving in this direction of a more integrated spiritual scientific approach to life, a more holistic understanding of things? What's one thing you would encourage our listeners to do?
Yeah, I would go to the be a farmer, start a garden. I'd ascribe to that's one of the more powerful revolutionary acts that you could undertake.
It's awesome.
Being that we're agricultural beings, that's there's something I call it personal agriculture. This idea that everyone should grow at least one thing that they eat,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a subtle magic to nurturing something and watching it grow, and then knowing that it's nourishing your body on this level that you really can't know what that is until you've done it, right? And so that challenge, and it's unfortunate how many people don't. I would
Right.
say probably the majority of people at this point in the United States. So that idea of kind of getting back to that basic tenet of nurturing something that is nourishing us, and is probably where I'd go with that one.
The This takes me back to the Taiwanese farmer, right? Like
Yeah.
he's like holding his wax apple tree. He's got graphs. He's showing us essentially how he just regenerates this one tree. And he goes, 99 ranch market wants me, like, over the last 3 years, this one tree, 1,000+ pounds of fruit at $20 a pound has made me 20 grand from one tree. And he's like, they want me to, like, build an entire farm of this one tree. And he's just like, I like this one. This one's doing a great job. He's got like several, but it was an interesting dynamic, right? Because he said, why, because my mom and him were commiserating about their journey, right? Like, I don't know if you know much about the history of Taiwan, but my grandparents, just like this gentleman, every 4 years flying back to Taiwan just to vote against China, to go back,
Wow.
put their vote in and say,
Wow.
totalitarianism, nationalist China, communist China, no, Like, we don't want you in our country. And I remember that till my grandparents essentially couldn't fly anymore. They would go back every 4 years, and they would come back with all this like traditional garb and all these like, election type stuff that we were just like, what are you doing? And then here we are, right? 3 years post of this global, World Economic Forum, this thing of tyranny. And at the root of it, you're essentially saying that we don't even know the gravity of growing one thing, nurturing that one thing, and the agency it is to then eat that one thing because of that literal like sweat equity that you put into it, the love, the connection, that connection of spirit and matter that so many of these people have said, so many of these forefathers and mothers of this perspective have said. And I believe we were making enough momentum and winning this essential spiritual war. And I believe that's why 2020 happened to begin with, is that we were gaining enough momentum of helping people remember the level of agency that they could have within. And here we are, right?
I think you're right.
And the solution's the same. I love that, man.
I think you're totally right. That's a brilliant story. That concept. I had an experience in Africa. I was sitting in a backyard of this woman that had graduated from this permaculture program, and she had this avocado tree. It was monstrous, hundreds of avocados on the ground, and we had just come from this farm, and the woman needed $10 a day to hire 10 laborers. Just unbelievable, right? And here I am in this yard with hundreds of avocados. Could have sold them for thousands of dollars, right? At a Whole Foods somewhere. And it's just like this wah, wah, wah moment of
crazy.
Like, whoa, what kind of world are we living in, right? And I had similar, did a food loans program out of my former retail store, and you take the perspective of the value of space, right? How you harvest and what you grow and what market you apply it to. And if you approach it from that angle, it's amazing where you can farm, where you wouldn't have imagined before, like that crop that, your Taiwanese farmer had figured out. So yeah, it's amazing what's all around us in that way. There's so much potential. Wow.
And I think we're at the rebirth, right? We're at the rebirth of this perspective. You're obviously, decades into this journey. I'm grateful to be, a novice, a super novice in this journey, but at least the journey is here, and this conversation, man, we got to meet one day. It's like this could go on for hours and hours into the night. And I wish I had that kind of time. And I know our listeners are probably at the edge of their seat, but I just wanted to thank you for this time, because it's these conversations that get really, really down, like grounded into the reality of what is truly possible for humanity, but for the world, that I get off on in a big way, because it's so much more than we could ever conceptualize with our human minds. And I'm just grateful to share that with you, man.
Man, gratitude's all mine, for real. I can see you seeking and digging, and it's totally inspiring. And yeah, man, I'm all about it. So we'll be in touch, and we'll meet one of these days. Don't worry about that.
Awesome, man.
We appreciate you joining us for this episode of the Future Generations podcast. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes and Spotify. For more resources based on today's episode, as well as more ways to inspire a brighter future for you and your family, visit us at thefuturegen.com. That's all available exclusively on thefuturegen.com.